1,517 people died. The world thought Titanic sank. But the ship that sank may not have been Titanic at all. To this day, no one knows for sure what ship was really in the North Atlantic that night and why. This is the story that history books don't tell. Wait, first, hear this. April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m. Frederick Fleet stood in the crow's nest, 60 feet above the ocean, surrounded by darkness, relying only on his eyes. His job was simple: watch the horizon and shout if he saw anything. Then he saw something, darker than the water, darker than the sky, coming straight toward them. He rang the bell 3 times, picked up the phone. "Iceberg, right ahead!" The order reached the bridge. Turn the ship, stop the engines. The 46,000-ton vessel began to turn, slowly, very slowly. The iceberg brushed against the ship below the waterline. No huge explosion, no dramatic crash, just a slight vibration. Some passengers thought the ship had merely brushed against something. 45 minutes later, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, walked into the captain's room. He didn't bring a calculator. He had already done the math in his head. 1 to 2 hours. There's no way to save her. 1,517 people died that night in water that was minus 2 degrees Celsius. But what everyone believed, that this was simply an accident, that the ship was Titanic, maybe it wasn't. The day the Titanic left Southampton, 10,000 people came to watch. Not passengers, spectators. People who had come simply to see it, because in 1912, the Titanic was not just a ship, it was a statement. It was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. It was 269 meters long. It weighed more than most people could imagine, and it had been described in the press and by its builders in terms that seemed to belong to a different category than ordinary ships. Unsinkable was the word that kept appearing. Not in the official White Star Line advertising, they were more careful than that, but in newspaper articles, in conversation, the passengers reflected the world as it existed in 1912, which is to say, they reflected a world of extraordinary inequality with almost no embarrassment about it. In first class, on the upper decks, were the wealthiest people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in America, worth something like $2 billion in today's money, was traveling with his 18-year-old wife, Madeline, who was 5 months pregnant. Benjamin Guggenheim was on board. Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, was traveling with his wife, Ida. These were people who lived in a way that most of the world's population could not comprehend, and their accommodations on the Titanic reflected this. Private promenades, a swimming pool, a squash court, a restaurant that served food comparable to the finest establishments in London or New York. In third class, in the lower decks near the waterline, were the people who had saved for months or years to afford a ticket. Irish farmers leaving a country that could no longer feed them. Lebanese families emigrating to America. Swedish couples who had heard that in the United States, a person could actually own land. People carrying everything they owned in a single trunk, sleeping 6 to a cabin, sharing bathrooms with hundreds of strangers, dreaming about what waited for them on the other side of the Atlantic. They were all on the same ship. They were not, in any meaningful sense, having the same experience. And when the ship sank, the difference in where you were sleeping would determine whether you lived or died with a precision that was almost mathematical. When the order came to load the lifeboats, most passengers did not believe it was necessary. This is the thing that is hardest to understand from a distance of more than 100 years. The Titanic did not feel like it was sinking. It was not listing dramatically. It was not making alarming sounds. It was, to most of the people standing on its deck in the cold April night, a ship that appeared to be floating perfectly normally. The officers who came to tell them to get into lifeboats, small wooden boats hanging 60 feet above the Black Ocean, were asking them to leave a large warm ship for what appeared to be no very obvious reason. Many passengers refused. Some went back to their cabins. Some went to the bar. The mathematics of the lifeboats was a separate catastrophe entirely. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. They had capacity for 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on board. Even if every lifeboat had been filled to capacity, which they were not, because in the early stages of loading, officers were sending boats away half empty, still not believing the situation was as serious as it was, there was not enough space for everyone. Someone had decided, at some point during the design process, that 20 lifeboats were enough. The regulations of the time actually required fewer than that. The Titanic exceeded the legal requirement and still had nowhere near enough. Isidore Strauss, the department store owner, was offered a place in a lifeboat. He refused to go before the other men. His wife Ida refused to leave without him. She was offered a place in a lifeboat and said, according to witnesses who were there, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die, together." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands. Neither survived. John Jacob Astor helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat and asked an officer if he could accompany her given her condition. The officer said no, women and children first. Astor accepted this without argument. He was last seen on deck smoking a cigarette. His body was recovered later. His wife survived. In third class, many passengers did not make it to the deck at all. The layout of the ship, the locked gates, the unfamiliar corridors, the language barrier for passengers who spoke no English, meant that by the time the lower deck passengers understood what was happening and found their way to the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were already gone. The survival rate in first class was 60%. In third class, it was 25%. The Titanic sank at 2:20 in the morning. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes from the collision to the moment the stern lifted out of the water, pointed at the sky, and slid beneath the surface. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. A person in the water without a life jacket would lose consciousness in 15 minutes. A person with a life jacket would survive perhaps 30 to 40 minutes before hypothermia made further survival impossible. The lifeboats were close enough to hear the people in the water. Most of them did not go back. Now, here is where the story changes. The White Star Line did not build just one ship. They built 3: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, sister ships of identical design, constructed at the same shipyard in Belfast within a few years of each other. The plan was for these 3 ships to dominate the transatlantic route between Britain and America. The Olympic launched first in 1910, and almost immediately, things started going wrong. In September 1911, 7 months before the Titanic sank, the Olympic was involved in a collision with a British Royal Navy cruiser called HMS Hawke in Southampton water. The damage was significant. The Olympic had to return to the shipyard for repairs, which took weeks and cost a great deal of money. White Star filed an insurance claim. The claim was rejected. A court ruled that the Olympic had been at fault for the collision. White Star received nothing, and the repairs had been expensive. Around this same time, inspectors examining the Olympic discovered something else: damage to one of the ship's propeller shafts that was not related to the Hawke collision. The shaft was cracked. Repairing it properly would mean taking the ship out of service for an extended period, losing revenue on every day it sat in the shipyard. White Star was not in a good financial position. The company had taken on enormous debt to build these ships. The Olympic was supposed to be generating income, not sitting in dry dock. And then someone, and here the documented history becomes the territory where questions live, appears to have had an idea. The Olympic and the Titanic were sister ships. They were not identical in every detail. The Titanic had been slightly modified during construction based on what had been learned from the Olympic's early voyages. But they were close enough that at a distance, in a photograph, to most observers, one could be mistaken for the other. The theory, argued by researchers including Robin Gardner in his book Titanic, the Ship That Never Sank, is this: the ships were switched. The damaged Olympic was repainted and refitted with the Titanic's name. The Titanic, technically the newer, undamaged ship, became the Olympic and continued in service. The ship that sank in the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912 was not the Titanic, it was the Olympic. The insurance motive is straightforward. The Titanic was insured for £5 million. The Olympic had just had an insurance claim rejected. A ship that sank on its maiden voyage, a genuine accident, an iceberg, unforeseeable, would generate a full insurance payout. White Star's financial problems would be solved. The evidence people point to is specific. Workers at the Harland and Wolff shipyard reported seeing the number 401, the Olympic's whole number, beneath fresh paint on what was being presented as the Titanic. Photographs from before the sinking appear to show discrepancies between what was labeled as the Titanic and what should have been the Titanic based on the construction records. The portholes on the port side did not match the configuration that the Titanic should have had at that stage of construction. And then there is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, a man whose financial decisions shaped the United States economy, had booked a first-class cabin on the Titanic's maiden voyage. He canceled at the last minute. His stated reason was that he was unwell and needed to remain at his health spa in France. Photographs from the days after the sinking show him in perfectly good health, entertaining guests. Morgan was not alone. A remarkable number of extremely wealthy and well-connected Americans canceled their Titanic bookings in the days before departure. Henry Clay Frick, steel magnate; Robert Bacon, former U.S. Secretary of State; Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer, paid a deposit and then canceled. George Vanderbilt booked and canceled. Whether these cancellations explanations were coincidence, the normal pattern of wealthy people who change their plans constantly, or something else, nobody has ever been able to say definitively, but they are documented. And J.P. Morgan, who effectively controlled White Star Line through his ownership of the International Mercantile Marine Company, canceled his voyage on the ship his company owned. The insurance payout was £5 million. In today's money, that is approximately $600 million. It was paid. For 73 years, the Titanic sat at the bottom of the ocean, and the theory could not be tested. Nobody knew exactly where it was. Nobody had the technology to reach it even if they had known. In September 1985, a joint American-French expedition, led by Robert Ballard, found it. 12,000 feet down, in two pieces, the bow and stern had separated as the ship sank, lying on the ocean floor in the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles below the surface. The discovery was the beginning of a new chapter in the Titanic story, and it was also, for the people who believed in the ship switch theory, the moment they had been waiting for. Because on the wreck, if you could read the hull numbers, you would know which ship was actually down there. Expeditions have recovered thousands of artifacts from the wreck. They have filmed every accessible part of the exterior, and researchers who have examined the evidence have found things that they say are consistent with the switch theory, and things that are not. A hull plate recovered from the wreck appears to show the number 401 beneath the surface, but the evidence is not clean. The wreck has been sitting on the ocean floor for more than a century. Metal corrodes, paint dissolves, numbers become difficult to read. The mainstream historical consensus is that the switch theory is not supported by sufficient evidence, that the Olympic and Titanic were similar but not identical, and that the differences would have made a switch extremely difficult to execute without detection by the hundreds of workers, inspectors, and officials who were involved in both ships. That J.P. Morgan's cancellation has a simpler explanation than foreknowledge of a planned sinking. The people who believe the theory say that is exactly what you would expect the official consensus to say. The Titanic has now been on the ocean floor for more than a century, and people are still dying trying to reach it. On June 18, 2023, a submersible called the Titan, operated by a company called OceanGate, lost contact with its support ship approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes after beginning its descent to the wreck. On board were 5 people: Stockton Rush, the CEO of OceanGate, who had designed and built the vessel; Paul-Henri Nargeolet, a French deep-sea explorer who had dived to the Titanic more than 30 times and was known as Mr. Titanic; Hamish Harding, a British billionaire and explorer; Shahzada Dawood, a Pakistani businessman; and his 19-year-old son, Suleiman, who had been reluctant to go, but had agreed because his father wanted the experience. The search for the Titan became one of the most watched news stories of 2023. For 4 days, the world followed the updates from the surface. The oxygen supply on board was estimated at 96 hours. Coast Guard vessels, military assets from multiple countries, remote underwater vehicles, all of it converging on a patch of the North Atlantic, trying to find a carbon fiber tube the size of a shipping container in 12,000 feet of water. On the 4th day, a remotely operated vehicle found debris on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck. The pattern of the debris was consistent with what investigators call a catastrophic implosion, the kind of structural failure that happens at depth when a vessel's hull gives way under the immense pressure of the deep ocean. At that depth, the pressure is approximately 400 times greater than at the surface. A structural failure at that pressure is not gradual, it is instantaneous. The people inside would have had no warning and no time to experience what was happening. The Titan had used a carbon fiber hull, a material that OceanGate's own engineers had warned was not appropriate for repeated deep ocean dives. A former OceanGate employee had raised safety concerns and been dismissed. The company had not sought certification from independent marine safety organizations because, Stockton Rush had said in interviews, he found the regulations too limiting. Stockton Rush died in the vessel he had built. So did the 4 people who had trusted him. At the bottom of the same ocean where 1,500 people died in 1912, 5 more people died in 2023, reaching the same wreck, still pulling people downward 111 years later. The Titanic is disappearing, slowly but measurably. A type of bacteria called Halomonas titanicae, named after the ship, is consuming the iron of the hull. Stalactites of rust, called rusticles, hang from every surface of the wreck. Scientists who have compared footage from the early expeditions in the 1980s with more recent dives say that sections of the ship that were intact intact 30 years ago, have now collapsed. The officers' quarters on the starboard side, well preserved in early footage, have largely fallen in. The crow's nest where Frederick Fleet stood on the night of April 14th is gone. Within perhaps 20 to 50 years, depending on whose estimate you believe, there will be nothing left that looks like a ship, just a rust stain on the ocean floor, and the debris field of objects too dense to be consumed. The boilers, the propellers, the anchor chain, the safe that was recovered and opened on live television in 1987 and found to contain a leather wallet and some soggy banknotes. The people recovered from the wreck's debris field over the years of expeditions number in the thousands of objects, but zero in terms of human remains. The cold, deep water preserved some things and dissolved others. There are shoes on the ocean floor, pairs of shoes placed by the current in positions that suggest the feet that were once inside them. Shoes last longer than bones in salt water. 1,517 people. Their names are recorded. Their stories, many of them, have been told and retold until they feel like characters from a film rather than human beings who were cold and frightened in the dark North Atlantic and did not survive the night. Ida Strauss, who would not leave her husband, the band that kept playing, the engineer who stayed at his post to keep the lights on, Frederick Fleet, who rang the bell 3 times and spent the rest of his life, he lived until 1965, being asked whether he could have seen the iceberg sooner if the binoculars had not been locked away, and whether that would have made any difference, and having to say that he did not know. The insurance conspiracy theory has never been proven. It has also never been definitively disproven. The ship is too deep, too degraded, and too politically complicated for anyone with the resources to investigate it properly to have done so with the kind of rigor that would settle the question. What is not a theory is this. The Titanic did not need to hit that iceberg. 7 ice warnings were received by the Titanic's radio operators on April 14th. 7. The ship did not slow down. The White Star Line was in a competitive battle with Cunard for the prestige of the fastest transatlantic crossing. The captain, Edward Smith, was on his final voyage before retirement. The ship was running close to full speed in waters that everyone on the bridge knew contained ice. What is also not a theory is that there were not enough lifeboats, that the third-class passengers had significantly lower survival rates than the first-class passengers, that the people who designed the ship, built the ship, approved the ship, and sold tickets on the ship made decisions that contributed to the deaths of 1,500 people, and that most of them faced no legal consequences for those decisions. The inquiry that followed the sinking lasted weeks, produced thousands of pages of testimony, and resulted in new regulations about lifeboat capacity and ice warnings, changes that should have existed before the Titanic sailed. Whether the ship that sank was the Titanic or the Olympic is a question that may never be answered. What is certain is that 1,500 people died in the cold North Atlantic on a night when the water was flat, the stars were clear, and a man in a crow's nest rang a bell 3 times and said the words that nobody on the bridge wanted to hear. The iceberg is gone. Icebergs melt. The ship is almost gone. Iron dissolves. The people who were on it are long gone. But the question of why they were there at all, that one is still open. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe, because there are many more.